Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to our session where you have a lot of competition going on, but I can see why you are here because this is also a very important topic. Today, this panel discussion is organized by Indian American Muslim Council. Indian American Muslim Council is the largest Washington, D.C. based advocacy organization of Indian American Muslims. With chapters across the U.S. established in 2002, IAMC advocates for peace and social justice to protect the fundamental and civil rights of all and safeguard pluralism and democracy granted by the constitutions of both India and United States. Today, the discussion would be about religious freedom in India, challenges and opportunities. Panelists will review India's overall democratic decline, including the worsening persecution of Muslims, Christians, Dalits, and other minorities, governmental crackdowns on civil liberties, and assault on free speech, and examining the appropriate responses the United States should consider when addressing such violations in India. With that, I invite our first of the panelists, Joanne Lynn, National Director, Amnesty International, USA.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Indian Americans Muslim Council for this invitation. I'm glad to be with all of you this afternoon. And I have to say, this is my first in-person conference and speaking engagement since the onset of the COVID pandemic. So it is truly special to be here with all of you. I bring greetings from Amnesty International, which is the world's largest human rights movement. And we have activists and members not only here in the United States, but in countries around the world. And I am pleased to join you for this very important discussion. Amnesty International India has been a target of the BJP-led government. Amnesty India's offices were raided in 2018 by the Enforcement Directorate, a financial investigation agency under the Ministry of Finance. And although a high court later unfroze some of the accounts in September 2020 with no warning from Indian officials, Amnesty India's remaining bank accounts were frozen, and Amnesty India was forced to halt all operations in India. So I'm sad to say that I no longer have colleagues, campaigners, researchers, and organizers working in India, the world's most populous democracy. The shuttering of Amnesty India is just one example of the Indian government activating an overbroad legal framework to crush human rights defenders who dare to challenge grave abuses of state authorities. The Indian government has leveraged financial and other institutions to strip human rights from religious minorities, to crush dissent, and to silence advocates for freedom of religion and expression. The most notable example of this is the use of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens to deny citizenship rights to Muslims and to create a high risk of deportation or internment for Muslims in India. The National Register of Citizens, also known as the NRC, is a list of people who can prove that they came to India before neighboring Bangladesh became an independent country in 1971. In 2019, authorities in Assam State published an NRC that excluded nearly 2 million people, placing them at risk of deportation or internment. The only institutional remedy available to those excluded from the NRC was through the Foreigners' Tribunals, a quasi-judicial body with a history of biased and discriminatory decision-making. Women are particularly disadvantaged in this process as they are less likely to have access to identity documents to prove their status. Following implementation of the NRC, over 1,000 foreigners were detained in overcrowded detention centers in Assam. The passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019 created a fast track to citizenship for many so-called foreigners. The CAA allowed migrants from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan to obtain Indian citizenship, essentially undoing the impact of their removal from the NRC. And the CAA applied broadly to members of 6 different religions, but importantly and notably excluded Muslims from eligibility. Used in tandem, the NRC and CAA have allowed the Indian government to broadly deny citizenship rights and then to reinstate them selectively, providing preferential treatment to members of favored religions while institutionalizing discrimination against Muslims. These 2 legislative tools used together amount to the Indian government punishing, excluding, and denying citizenship rights to Muslims. Beyond the blatantly discriminatory impacts of the CAA and NRC, the enforcement of these laws together has posed grave health dangers since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Foreigners have been subjected to detention in Assam's overcrowded detention facilities, exposing them to grave health risks posed by virtue of their confinement. Amnesty International is urging the U.S. government to press Indian authorities to repeal the Citizenship Amendment Act. The U.S. government should call for the release of human rights defenders and other critics, many who have been held for over a year without charge. In addition, Amnesty calls for the investigation and prosecution of those responsible for attacks carried out by vigilante mobs and police officers against Muslims during the February-March 2020 violence in Delhi, which occurred in the context of protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act. These steps are necessary to ensure that religious freedom is a reality for all people in India, regardless of their religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. We hope that not only Amnesty International, but other such organizations soon will be able to open their offices. Now I invite Anurima Bhargava, Commissioner, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedoms.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here with you, with many familiar faces, and I want to be able to speak about the work that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has done on India, and in particular our recommendations for the last 2 years with regards to India. And so just a little bit of background on the Commission before I start, and which is that the Commission is an independent, bipartisan commission that was set up by the International Religious Freedom Act, and there are 9 of us, and we spend our time looking at the ways in which the freedom of religion or belief is practiced abroad, and we document and monitor the ways in which religious practice, whether it is allowed and able to be practiced freely in countries all across the world. And we have monitored many countries in South Asia, and including India. And in the last 2 years, we make recommendations to the State Department, to Congress, and to the administration about where we see there are violations on religious freedom. And for India, for the last 2 years, we have recommended that because of the systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations that are happening with regards to religious freedom in India, that it be designated a country of particular concern, which we have done for other countries in South Asia like Pakistan and Burma. And much of what Joanne, my longtime colleague in the human rights world, who worked with me in many other contexts, and so it's great to see you here as well, has already talked about, is because of the ways in which we're seeing national and state policies in India create a sort of ecosystem that is really taking a different turn with regards to the long history that we have in India, a constitution, a national government, a judiciary that really protected pluralism, the ability of people to worship freely, and we're seeing something quite different happen in the last few years. And so I'm gonna do something different than what I planned, which is because we heard quite a lot about the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens and what's happening in Assam, and I will say that is something that we at the Commission have documented a number of times through hearings, which is the ways in which citizenship laws, much like Burma, where we saw that the citizenship laws being used to target the Rohingya. We're seeing that again here in India with the Citizenship Amendment Act and with the National Register of Citizens, and obviously Assam being a place where we've seen how that has played out over the last couple of years. The concerns being that that because there's this question of how you prove up your citizenship, and then not having a pathway for Muslims in particular to be able to demonstrate that they have citizenship through the Citizenship Amendment Act and the pathways that are being provided there, that there might be, and certainly has been for many, a situation in which they may find themselves detained, stateless, or no longer part of the country that they have long lived in. And so the idea that that would extend across the country is something that certainly has underlied the concerns of the Commission for the last couple of years, since December 2019 when the CAA was passed, and then going into the violence that we saw in 2020, which not only related to the concerns about CAA, but also led to a situation where we've seen the worst mob violence, as has already been talked about in Delhi in many years, that ended up with the deaths of many, largely Muslims, including Hindus. So I want to talk about a couple other things that are going on which in India, which we're gravely concerned about. And some of that is the ways in which there's been a silencing of any kind of efforts to speak up, to talk freely about what is happening with regards to religious freedom. And so let me start with where Joanne and Amnesty International certainly got caught in the crosshairs, which is the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act. And not only did that act impact places like Amnesty International, but also a lot of religious organizations, a lot of organizations that are trying to actually, organizations that many of you are associated with, who are trying to actually provide assistance, create community, create interreligious bonds on the ground. And so what the Foreign Contribution Regulations Act has done is really cut off the ability of funding, but also partnership from many organizations, multinational organizations, international organizations, to be able to do what they have done for a long time in India, which is to try and engage communities in a variety of different ways, allow them to worship. And so unfortunately, the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act is reflective of this ideology of anything that is questioning this move towards a much more of a Hindu nationalist state, anything that is allowing for other influences to come in is being questioned or cut off, and that's so we see that with the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act. We also see it with there's this slate of laws that were older laws that are now being reactivated right now to try and use them to quelch dissidents, to quelch those who are trying to speak out about what's happening in India with regards to religious communities. And another one of those is the UAPA. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the UAPA, it is essentially a law that was used to talk about those who are advocating sedition. But it is being used to really detain advocates, detain journalists, detain people who are just trying to disseminate information. And unfortunately, as all of you, I'm sure, are well aware, Father Stan Swami was arrested under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and among many other human rights advocates and media was held, unfortunately, pre-trial. So before there was even a chance to actually have those charges brought and evidenced. And so we're seeing a situation, the UAPA doesn't really allow as a very high standard for someone to get bail or to be able to come out. So people can be detained and held for quite a long time without even really being charged. And in the case of Father Stan Swami, who lost his life last week because of Parkinson's and COVID, and I just want to say right now that I think one of the things that we've witnessed in the last many months in India is the ways in which the kinds of practices we were seeing around religious freedom mapped onto how COVID was being handled as well, which is that so when we don't actually have the ability to engage people from outside of the country in supporting efforts to try and address COVID, the kind of communities across the country who have long been persecuted and marginalized, the Dalits, the Adivasis, the Muslims, Christians, many other communities that are impoverished were facing the brunt of what that meant in terms of the kind of restrictions. So the UAPA is yet another one of these laws, along with the Foreign Contributions Regulations Act, that we're seeing being used in a way to really silence and to set out a different kind of narrative about what's happening in India, and that is a real issue because we have a situation in which we also have a lot of false information. There's a lot of hatred. There's a lot of disinformation that's being spread. And when that happens and there is, a silencing of other voices, we see, and we have seen across India, that lead to a lot of mob violence and persecution of communities based on false information and based on, conjecture about what it is that those communities are engaged in. And so that has been, the long history around cow slaughter. And now in the last couple of years, attacks on places of worship, attacks on religious congregations. Those are all also happening in ways that are even during COVID were significantly problematic. The other area that we're seeing the kind of concerns that we documented in our reports is with regards to things like anti-conversion laws, and essentially how I describe it, this attack on any kind of interfaith, interreligious engagement, right? So anti-conversion laws are laws, and there's a third of Indian states have these kinds of laws on the books that limit or prohibit religious conversion to protect the dominant religion from any perceived threats from religious communities and religious minorities. And so what we saw last year was there was new legislation in the same vein as anti-conversion that basically really targeted any interfaith marriages. And so it basically, and the problem with both of this, like the conversion laws and these interfaith laws, is that they're pretty vague about what it is that they're targeting. So they'll talk about force, inducement, allurement, coercion, or fraud. But essentially what's happening is whenever there's any kind of interfaith effort, there's a suggestion that, and particularly we're seeing this with non-Hindus, that those non-Hindus are being arrested. There's been detentions. There's been questioning of those marriages. And so there's a lot of harassment and violence that are directed towards anyone who's engaging in those kinds of marriages. And so the concern that we have more broadly is this move towards saying that, again, any engagement across religion is a problem, whether it be in marriage or whether it be in other areas, which is again not very much contrary to the very foundation upon which India has been built, which is one of secular pluralism. And lastly, I do want to just speak to some of the recommendations that we at USCIRF have made to the State Department. Again, let me go back for a moment and say that we recommended for the second year running in our 2021 report that India be designated a country of particular concern for the systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. We also have recommended that those individuals, and there are individuals at the state and at the national level who have fomented the kind of hate, but have also implemented policies that are targeting religious communities, that there be sanctions, whether in the economic or in terms of visas, be placed against those officials, and have also really urged the United States government, broad scale, to think about how these human rights violations, and it's hard for us, right? Because India, we speak of India as, for a long time, the first thing you always hear is it's the nation's largest democracy, and it is, right? But when we lose, as a friend said to me the other day, when we start to see what we're seeing in India, which is the loss of democracy in India, we're seeing the loss of democracy in the world, because India is one of those places, I mean, if you look at where democracy is, it is one of the few places in the world where you see, in Black and brown communities, you see a democracy that has been thriving. And so just to imagine what it would be like to see the kind of persecution we're seeing is of great concern. And so we're seeing the rise of religious nationalism in India and obviously around the world. But given that it's the world's largest democracy and something that that certainly is an ally for the United States in so many ways in that part of the world, it's important that we figure out how in the quadrilateral dialogues that we have, but also in many different forums, we still make sure that the reason for our underlying shared sense of values is not gone. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. there are many other things going on. I'm sure if Anurama has time, she can cover it. Many more egregious things happening. What reminds me from what she reminded me of is Father Stan Swami, 84-year-old frail man, Parkinson's disease. You all know, probably seen Muhammad Ali or Michael Fox with Parkinson. They can't keep their hands shaken, and he did not get a straw to drink the water. Entire time he was in jail. It's cruel. Our next panelist is Sravya Tadapalli, board member, Hindus for Human Rights organization. It's an Indian American Hindus organization established in United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Indian American Muslim Council, for the opportunity to speak. In recent years, right-wing advocates that purport to represent Hindus have promoted a peculiar narrative to prop up international support of India's major abuses toward religious minorities. By using human rights rhetoric, many Hindutva supporters have falsely argued that religious freedom is not under threat in India, and anti-Muslim BJP policies are actually moral necessities. Hindus for Human Rights is a progressive organization that advocates for human rights in South Asia and North America from a Hindu faith perspective. We aim to advocate for an inclusive vision of Hinduism and challenge right-wing Hindu ideas about India. Today, I want to briefly discuss how pro-Hindutva advocacy groups often frame Indian human rights issues and challenge some of these interpretations, particularly with regard to the state of religious freedom in India, the military occupation of Kashmir, and the Citizenship Amendment Act. When we talk about religious freedom in India, it is very common for people to say there's no issue. The recent Pew study on religion in India found the vast majority of Indians, including minorities, feel that they can practice their religion freely. Thankfully, we do not see the mass atrocities against religious minorities in India that we see in China and Saudi Arabia. But religious freedom is more than simply the freedom to believe and attend a house of worship, which, by the way, many Dalit Hindus are still unable to do. If a particular religious community is targeted because of their belief practices, appearance, or diet, if their freedom of speech is being curbed, or if their citizenship is being threatened because of their religion, that is also a threat to religious freedom. This is what is happening to religious minorities in India today as they disproportionately face detention without trial, the threat of citizenship loss, and lynchings. We can have arguments about what to do about these facts, but the fact is that religious freedom is under a severe attack in India because of the policies of the ruling party. Some pro-Hindutva organizations have argued that India's 2019 revocation of special status for Jammu and Kashmir was necessary to protect the region from terrorism and allow Hindu Kashmiri Pandits who were forced out of the region in the 1990s to return to their homelands. But in India's efforts to supposedly fight terrorism, the government jailed political leaders, denied internet access for 18 months, and significantly restricted press freedom and public protest. In the meantime, thousands of Kashmiri Pandits have been forced to live in poor conditions as internally displaced people in Jammu and Delhi. Kashmiri Hindus currently living in the valley have reported facing increased risk from local resentment of Hindu nationalist policies. What is clear is that 1, the BJP has used the threat of terrorism to curtail human rights to millions of Muslims, and 2, the BJP has failed to solve the challenge of terrorism or take care of the needs of Hindu Pandits. The rhetoric that Kashmir's occupation is a human rights move is an attempt to cast a sheen over India's cruel denial of basic freedom to Kashmiri Muslims. When the Citizenship Amendment Act passed in 2019, organizations that purport to represent Hindus argued that the law was necessary to protect religious minorities fleeing violence in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. There is no question that the threat facing religious minorities in these countries is severe. But the CAA notoriously created a broad exclusion of Muslims, violating India's constitutional requirement for equal treatment of all religions and keeping persecuted Muslim communities like Ahmadiyya and Shia Muslims from attaining long-term asylum. Furthermore, because India is creating a National Register of Citizens, or NRC, that would require all Indians to prove their citizenship, Indian Muslims unable to prove their citizenship would not be protected by the Citizenship Amendment Act, facing the risk of detention and deportation. Under the guise of refugee policy, CAA poses a dangerous threat to India's freedom of religion and has thus far failed to protect any persecuted Hindus or Sikhs. More than a year after the CAA passed in 2019, hundreds of Hindu and Sikh refugees have returned to Pakistan. India has long been a refuge for persecuted people from around the world, and it should continue to be that for everybody, including Muslims. I have two core beliefs that are central to my identity as a Hindu. One, a belief that every human being is inherently divine. And two, that there are many paths of worship and all end in God. HFHR's faith values lead us to fight for all religious minorities, whether in India, Pakistan, or the United States. In addition to being critical of Hindu nationalist arguments that invoke human rights, I urge you to raise your voices on the deteriorating religious freedom situation in India. Pay attention to when Hindu groups speak and when they remain silent about religious freedom. Hindu nationalists certainly do not represent all Hindus. There is another Hindu vision for the world, an inclusive one. Thank you.
Thank you, Sravya. She reminded me, she mentioned about the diet laws. I would like every one of you who have not visited India or even visited India to please visit. It's a wonderful country. But please do not ask for a steak there. Your life is in danger. Next panelist is Reverend Evangeline Anderson-Rajkumar from Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.
Good evening, everyone. I am Reverend Dr. Evangeline Anderson-Rajkumar, served as a professor in a seminary or 5 seminaries for 20 odd years, and now a pastor of 2 Lutheran congregations in Corydon, Indiana. More important than that is I'm a Dalit. It would have been considered impossible for a Dalit to come up and speak simply because a Dalit body is the site of pollution. That which decides the purity of the dominant other. I do not want to say the pure, this in this caste hierarchy, to consider oneself as higher caste, upper caste is such a myth. There is nothing upper about the upper caste and lower about. And therefore, to say that whereas the potential of a person deemed with dignity and worth is a God-given reality, we have a situation in India where the Brahminic Hindutva forces can actually challenge that and deny whole people of their ability to reflect the image of God and their possibility of even being considered as a worthy human being, of being human. And this is the crux of the whole problem of caste consciousness, where the Dalits, tribals, and Christians, women, you find there is that coming together of that intersectionality of race, caste, gender, and patriarchy, all held together. And therefore, to make their bodies as the site of violence is actually a way of reminding those people that collective humanity of their fundamental right to be human. It is a way of reminding them that if they ever cross or transgress those lines, boundaries that are drawn for them, they can expect violence. So violence is a way of keeping, quote unquote, that polluting other within the boundaries, control their bodies and their movement, control the space that they occupy. And that is why, for us to analyze the situation, it seems as if the Constitution is irrelevant. It seems as if the Constitution is redundant simply because we have been just enumerating all these incidents of violence, and we see, on the other hand, absolute impunity on the part of those who perpetuate violence. Not only impunity, but also support, tacit support of them to make sure that they do not get the punishment that they richly deserve. Instead, they are rewarded. So, if this has been the history of the marginalized, the Dalits, tribals, Christians being sidelined as a nobody, then there is very little of change that we see. If you try to map the different incidents of violence that happened in Indian context, 1992, yes, targeting the Muslim bodies. 2002, Godhra, once again, the Muslim become the targets, the sites of all violence. 2008 is Kandhamal. The tears of people in Kandhamal have not yet dried. And that is why, for us, I'm wondering whether we need to change the whole pattern of our thinking. How do we hold the power, those who abuse the power, how can we hold them accountable? I believe that it is only when they are economically pinched. Sorry, I'm just imagining new words. Only when they feel those sanctions in a public space, in a global platform, the aspect of shame works. They do not want to be shamed in a global public arena. And I believe that is a way we can focus our attention. Just the fact that India is now 11th, it ranks 11th as a country that has no respect for religions and where religious freedom. I think to consolidate our voices and continue to prop them up as those who should be shamed. It's saying that we distinguish between Indian and Indian. And as the previous speaker said, we do not put the whole Hindu faith into one box. No, not at all. But delineate that Hindutva force that stands as the culprit to rob millions of lives, especially the Dalit tribal Christians, of their right to human dignity. I pause here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend. If somebody doesn't know what does she refer to Kandhamal, Kandhamal is a northeast area where there is a large number of Christians live there, and what she's referring to was during Christmas season, there was an open violence against Christians, churches, fathers, nuns burned down the houses and churches. That's what she's referring to. Now I invite Tabassum Haleem, CEO of Islamic Networks Group.
This is supposed to be the easy part.
Good afternoon. Thank you again to the IAMC for the opportunity to speak today. It is my incredible honor to be here among my esteemed, notably women panelists. India has a rich history of religious pluralism and tolerance, including among many Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and others. However, today, my presentation focuses on how Islamophobia is deployed by extremist groups in India. Although my organization, Islamic Networks Group, presents on the transnational scope of Islamophobia among Western nations, we also know that Islamophobia is being deployed in non-white nations, including India. So what is Islamophobia? Islamophobia is defined as anti-Muslim racism and involves viewing and portraying Muslims as being monolithic and static, separate and other, inferior to the West and what it stands for, as barbaric, irrational, primitive, and sexist, as people who are engaged in a clash of civilizations, as violent, aggressive people who support terrorism. And Islam is now viewed as a political ideology cloaked as a religion, which is very problematic when you consider religious liberties. So what are the roots of Islamophobia? We find the images and stereotypes of Muslims as infidels and as warring people promoted as early as the Crusades, from the 11th to the 13th centuries. This view was reinforced from the 15th to the 20th centuries when European countries colonized most parts of the world. The colonizers asserted their power over colonized people by defining themselves as smarter, more capable, more human, and describing occupied peoples as backwards and in need of civilizing. They also cast occupied peoples as enemies of Christianity and Western civilization. In Western societies, these disparaging views of Muslims have persisted, and Islamophobia has become integrated in various institutional settings like education, media, video games, and even Hollywood, leading to systemic racism and discrimination. And of course, these influences lead to the adoption of stereotypes that can influence one's subconscious and even override one's values as demonstrated by various studies. That means that even if you don't believe that you're biased or racist, your subconscious makes you behave in biased and racist ways. Despite the fact that Islamophobia came out of white and Christian supremacy, it is now the tool of oppression outside of the West, often used to justify dispossession of Muslims in the pursuit of power, land, and resources in places like Myanmar, China, and India. Turning our attention to India specifically, Islamophobia is used as a foil for Hindu supremacy. In order to establish ethnic and religious supremacy, Muslims and other religious minorities are used as a foil to justify Hindu supremacy and Hindu nationalist ideals. An example is the love jihad narrative. There is a perception among some Hindu nationalists that Muslims seek to marry Hindus in order to convert them to Islam. Thus, interreligious Hindu-Muslim marriages are discouraged, discredited, and even criminalized in order to maintain the purity of the Hindu nation. Laws that prohibit or limit religious conversion have been passed in 10 of India's 28 states to protect the dominant religion from the perceived threats of Islam and Christianity. Hindu converts to Islam and their Muslim spouses can be jailed from 5 to 10 years in some states. Beginning in March 2020, some Hindutva supporters began spreading false rumors on social media that Muslims were waging a corona jihad. by intentionally infecting Hindus. Indian Muslims have often been seen as foreigners and a threat by Hindu nationalists to the purity of the Hindu Rashtra or nation, despite the fact that the vast majority of Muslims in India are indigenous Indians. As mentioned before, this trope is reflected in the 2019 Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens, which only discriminates against Muslim refugees. Other forms of legislation have been passed to curtail the rights of Muslims and impose Hindu cultural norms. Other Islamophobic tropes are often used by Hindutva supporters to scapegoat Muslims for their own political gain, including that Muslims are terrorists. A prominent Hindu nationalist supported former U.S. President Trump's Muslim ban and stated that similar action is needed to contain terror activities in this country. Especially after 9/11, Muslims in India, as well as Pakistan, Kashmir, and Myanmar, are frequently linked to terrorism. Another Hindu nationalist was quoted as saying, "Why should we tolerate Rohingya refugees when they pose a security threat to the nation?" Finally, I want to end on a hopeful note to remind us that all of this can be reversed when we consider India's history of not only conflict, but also cooperation and coexistence. We at ING maintain that education and engagement are the best tools at our disposal. We must learn to respect and celebrate our differences if we are to coexist and thrive as communities and nations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tabassum, very well. I'm glad you have described what Islamophobia is, because there are a lot of misconceptions. Next, we have Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts. He couldn't come.
Hello, I'm Senator Ed Markey, and it's an honor and privilege to address this year's International Religious Freedom Summit in Washington, D.C. And I would like to thank the Indian American Muslim Council for inviting me to share a few words. Religious freedom is a core principle upon which the United States was founded, a key tenet of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And today, protection for religious freedom now form the cornerstone of democracies worldwide. Unfortunately, we are seeing increasing numbers of governments restrict rather than protect religious freedom in their laws and actions around the entire globe. For many minority groups around the world, religious persecution is an urgent concern, not an artifact of history. Laws that criminalize the rejection, abandonment, or speech critical of certain beliefs are harmful restraints on religious freedom and human rights. India has long had an admirable commitment to pluralism. It is the world's largest democracy, whose bonds with the American people continue to grow. But the United States is right to speak up and speak out when a fellow democracy and strategic partner fails to protect the rights of all their people. That is why I remain seriously concerned about the Indian government's commitment to protecting the rights of minorities, including the 200 million Muslims in India, the government's targeting of social and political activities, and crackdown on free speech, and their religiously motivated discrimination against minorities cannot be viewed in isolation, as escalating nationalism threatens to undermine India's long-standing oath to democratic values. I will continue to stand up for these principles in the United States Senate, and I will encourage India to do the same. Thank you all for being here today to advocate for religious freedom globally and allowing me to share a few words on this crucial topic. I continue to hope that we can all work together to continue to promote the protection of human rights worldwide. I thank you, each and every one of you, for everything you do to protect the rights of everyone in India, in the United States, and every other place on this planet. Thank you.
Next, we have U.S. Representative Marie Newman from Illinois.
Greetings, and so good to be here. Thank you to the Indian American Muslim Council for inviting me to speak out about human rights and religious freedom in India. I'm so glad you're having this summit. It's incredibly important. Over the last several years, I've connected with many Indian Americans in my district and learned about the injustices. Throughout my candidacy and certainly throughout my first 6 months in office, I've been very clear about human rights and what's happening in marginalized communities here in America, but in Palestine, China, Yemen, India, across the globe. We must speak out about these horrifying events. Unfortunately, in recent years, India is facing the same right-wing fascism that attempted to destroy our own democracy not that long ago. I believe that this is happening frequently and more frequently than we can imagine throughout our nation and other nations. I believe this ultra-nationalism and this very supremacist ideology are the greatest threats to our national security. In the last 7 years, hundreds of Muslims just walking down the street have been attacked by vigilante mobs. They've been lynched. It is a travesty of justice, and I'm horrified by it. Religious minorities, social and political activists, lawyers, journalists, and even students are attacked all the time. The worst brunt of the government's persecution is being faced by India's 200 million Muslims, who now face statelessness thanks to this horrible National Register for Citizens, or the NRC as it's called. I can't get over it. I didn't think I'd see this in my lifetime, but we are. Across India, but especially in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh, Muslims have been subjected to killings alarming even the United Nations officials who wrote to the Uttar Pradesh government about these killings. Amnesty International has documented the violence against Muslims, whether from the police in response to the protests against the citizenship law, or in the Indian capital of New Delhi last year by rioting mobs who were allegedly part of Hindu nationalists. Thousands of Muslims who protested the citizenship law, as well as those who lost family members and property in the violence against them, continue to be in prison. Our own report from the United States Department, released by Secretary Blinken in 2020, speaks at length about the persecution of India's Muslims and Christians. The report said, and I quote, "There were reports of religiously motivated killings, assaults, riots, discrimination, vandalism, and actions restricting the right of individuals to practice and speak about their religious beliefs." The report further states that Muslim academics, human rights activists, former police officers, and journalists allege anti-Muslim bias in the investigation in relation to Delhi. India is the world's second most populated country with over 1.3 billion people. Religious persecution, violation of human rights, curbs on civil and political rights are going to make India less secure, not more, I assure you. India's equity and standing in the eyes of the world are severely damaged. Already, Freedom House has downgraded its rating for India's democracy from being free to partly free. That's heartbreaking. Persecution of entire sections of society, especially when backed by governments, is a recipe for a future filled with disaster. We must do better. We must pressure both our adversaries and our allies to support human rights around the world for the sake of a cohesive existence and sustainable peace across the globe. Hate anywhere is unacceptable. So my message to you is thank you for your great work. I am your partner, and you can reach out to me whenever you would like. And I appreciate deeply what you do across the globe, and certainly for India and what you do here in America. We're all neighbors and we're all a community. So with that, I wish you all well. Thank you.
Next, we have U.S. Representative Andy Levin from Michigan.
I'm Congressman Andy Levin from Michigan's 9th District, and I'm truly thrilled to be with you all today. I sit on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I've got the privilege of serving as Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation, kind of a mouthful. So as you might imagine, India is a big focus of my work in Congress. But I'm particularly excited to be with you, not just because of that work and not just because this is such an important topic, but also because it's one that's so deeply personal to me as someone who has lived in India and been totally enamored with India and its people for most of my life. I'm humbled to have been asked to talk to you about religious freedom in India, the challenges in front of us, and what I believe is necessary to overcome those challenges. I realize, of course, that not all of you will agree with my assessments. I understand and honestly welcome those differences. Spirited debate and diverse opinions and beliefs are a touchstone of any healthy democracy. More on that in a moment. But I hope you will understand that I come into this discussion with a deep love for India and a genuine desire to see its democracy and people thrive. Now, before we get into all that, a little about my own personal history. I first visited India way back in 1978, fresh out of high school. I traveled widely with my dad, who was then assistant administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development in the Carter administration. We visited Delhi, Agra, Hyderabad, and Calcutta, as well as Nepal, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. The impact on me of this trip was immediate. It was overwhelming, and literally it was life-changing. I fell head over heels in love with India. When I went to college, I became a religion major with a focus on Buddhist philosophy of India and Tibet. And I went back again and again, spending a year in Uttar Pradesh during college and a summer in Karnataka during graduate school, where I continued my studies of South Asian religions. And I traveled around at that time with my now wife to Delhi, Rajasthan, Kashmir, and Ladakh. In a beautiful country where there's so much to experience, I was struck most of all by its religious pluralism and raucous democratic culture. Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, different peoples living together in one democracy. Imperfect to be sure, but still a remarkable example of overwhelmingly peaceful coexistence amidst super rich diversity. The India of Narendra Modi today is not the India I fell in love with. And his government's failure to uphold the freedoms so pivotal to a democracy's survival, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and of course, freedom of religion, are the reason why. Given the topic at hand today, I'll focus on freedom of religion. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom released a chilling report this year describing what it called, quote, Hindu nationalist policies resulting in systemic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. The report describes attacks on religious freedom in India that occurred throughout 2020, from disinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic that targeted religious minorities, to attempts to ban interfaith marriages, to riots in Delhi, where more than 50 people died and 200 were injured, most of them Muslims. The report called this, and I'm quoting again, the worst Hindu-Muslim mob violence in more than 3 decades, in which mobs supportive of Hindu nationalism, quoting again, operated with impunity, using brutal force to single out Muslims, attack mosques, and destroy homes and businesses in majority Muslim neighborhoods. All of these examples are deeply upsetting, but perhaps what is most alarming about this report to me is the fact that these attacks are not new. They're part of a pattern we've seen becoming increasingly clear and prevalent under Prime Minister Modi. The incidents that occurred in 2020 followed what the commission called, quote, a drastic turn downward, end quote, for religious freedom in India in 2019. That year saw the re-election of the BJP, Modi's party, which, according to the commission, used its parliamentary wins to put in place policies that violated religious freedom nationwide, particularly that of Muslims. Perhaps the best known example of such policies took place when Prime Minister Modi made good on his campaign promise to strip Muslim majority Jammu and Kashmir of the privileged status it held under India's constitution for 70 years. That move was paired with draconian measures taken under the guise of security, including restrictions on freedom of movement and phone and internet blackouts. Numerous reports indicate that during this time, mosques were closed and imams and Muslim leaders were arrested. Now, I expect some of you are wondering why I'm harping on these points after I told you about how deeply I love India. Why would I be so critical and so publicly critical of a country that I love? The answer is, it's because I love India that I'm committed to ending these attacks on its people. It's because I'm so passionate in my support for the vibrant democracy I came to know as a young man that I want to see that democracy flourish for generations to come. And it's because I believe firmly that no problem can be solved with silence that I call it out so that it can be diagnosed and remedied. Another part of my answer is my love of Hinduism itself and my understanding through my years of study about how broad and accepting Hinduism has been throughout most of its history as the world's oldest major religion. Hinduism contains multitudes of tradition and a stunning array of observance within its bountiful skirts. It has absorbed many waves of new ideas, even as it has existed peacefully with acceptance alongside other religions. To me, that was core to the very idea of India, and a central ingredient explaining how a vast and poor country could develop the world's largest democracy. Much of the credit went to the compassionate and accepting nature of Hindu Dharma. For so many centuries, Hinduism has maintained the passionate allegiance of 80% of Indians without being politicized or used to bash other faiths. I should say that the issues I've talked about today, the ever more infrequent infringements upon human rights, they're not unique, in my view, to religious freedom, nor to India. That's another reason I believe we must have a conversation about them. They are, I fear, part of a global rise in ethno-nationalism. And we've seen that manifest itself in places as diverse as Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil, Viktor Orban's Hungary, in what until recently was Bibi Netanyahu's Israel, and of course, in Donald Trump's America. I'm a believer in collective liberation, in the need for oppressed people in every corner of our planet to link arms in solidarity so that we're stronger than our oppressors. In order to do that, though, we must see these patterns for what they are and recognize our shared struggle. These uncomfortable conversations about the need for reforms in the countries we love are essential, not just for the citizens of the countries in question, but for all peoples whose rights have been violated and all people who wish to see a more just and peaceful and beautiful world. I'm one of those people. And while I know it won't always make me the most popular congressman, I'm going to use my platform as a member of this incredible body to help build that more just and peaceful world however I can. I will continue to oppose violations of religious freedom vocally and will encourage the Biden administration to do the same. I will question government officials everywhere about their policies and encourage them to change the ones that undermine human rights. I will work with my colleagues, Democratic and Republican, to determine how US policy can help bring an end to those abuses. And I will hold tight to the belief that India's democracy can and will be a democracy for all of its people, one that embraces the human rights and dignity of every single person. Namaskar. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Anantanand Ram Bachchan, Professor of Religion.
Greetings. Hinduism is the name of a family of religious traditions, sharing many teachings and practices, while preserving also the uniqueness of each member. The world Hindu population is estimated to be 1 billion, making Hinduism the third largest religion. 90% of Hindus live in South Asia, but there are growing communities all over the world. Hinduism does not have a single historical founder. It is centered on a body of teachings, the earliest and most important of which are derived from the Vedas. Because the Hindu tradition is so internally diverse, it generally exemplifies an open and hospitable attitude to religious diversity. One of the pillars of Hindu theism is the belief in the unity and oneness of God, even though this one God is spoken of in diverse ways. The one being the wise speak of in many ways is an important statement from the Rig Veda, Hinduism's most ancient scripture. Differences are important, but so also is our unity. God's oneness implies the oneness of the human community. I believe, wrote Gandhi, in the absolute oneness of God and therefore of humanity. All beings are part of a single human community and ought to be treated with dignity, justice, and compassion, and be accorded equal rights. What is Hindutva? Hindutva or Hinduness is not a religious teaching, but an ideology of Indian identity espoused in the early 20th century by Vinayak Damodar Sarvarkar in his well-known book with the same title, Hindutva. According to Sarvarkar, to be entitled to the full rights of Indian citizenship, one must satisfy three criteria. First, one must be a citizen of India. Second, a descendant of Indian ancestors. And third, one must have homage for Indian culture that is preserved in Sanskrit. This includes recognition of India as one's holy land. On the basis of this third criteria, Sarvarkar excluded Indian Muslims and Indian Christians. In his view, these communities were loyal to alien cultures and regarded lands other than India as their holy land. He treated their loyalty to India with suspicion. Hindutva is one version of an exclusivist national ideology with variants around our world. One of the many problems of Hindutva is that it conflates national and religious identity. Although it accepts Sikhs, Jains, and South Asian Buddhists as Indians or Hindus, it excludes Indian Muslims and Indian Christians. Hindutva regards them as followers of alien religions and not entitled, therefore, to equal national status. Hindutva does not share the hospitality of Hinduism to religious diversity. It makes a sharp distinction between Hindus and non-Hindus and devalues non-Hindus, creating the conditions for hostility and for violence. In addition, Hindutva champions a form of majority rule that is intolerant of plural identities by asserting a definition of nationality and loyalty that excludes large numbers of people for whom India is their only home. It betrays the core theological commitments of Hinduism by ascribing unequal worth to persons on the basis of religious identity and by seeking to deprive them of equal rights in the civic sphere. There is an ancient and a powerful tradition of hospitality to religious diversity in the Hindu tradition, which made it possible to accommodate a wide diversity of religious beliefs and practices and to offer shelter to persecuted religious groups for centuries. It is this genuine hospitality that can once again point the way forward. There are teachings in the Hindu tradition that offer solid grounds for diversity, for justice, for dignity, and for the equal worth of all human beings. We must lift up these Hindu teachings and reject the divisive ideology of Hindutva. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.